In TISSUE.2, we're discussing connective tissues. The standard reads, I can describe the structure, function, and characteristics of different types of connective tissue, and in your textbook, this covers section 5.3. So you already have this heading in your notes, and this first slide is a repeat from the last video. So in Unit 2, we're talking all about different types of tissues. So we're discussing similar cells that share a function. We're doing histology in the lab, where we're also identifying these tissue types under the microscope. And we said that there are 4 major types of tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nerve. Last video, we discussed all the different types of linings and epithelial tissues that exist. Today, we're going to talk about what is underneath those linings. What is making up the bulk of your body? All of the things in between, basically. That is connective tissue. So your first new subheading for today is TISSUE.2 connective tissues. Connective tissue has so many diverse functions that it is really hard to classify. It binds things together, it supports and protects, it fills up spaces, stores fat, produces blood, fights infection, repairs tissue, all of those things based on what specialized form of connective tissue they are. Connective tissue also contains what's called an extracellular matrix, which means it's protein fibers and other substances that aren't living cells, but they're fluid or solid, and they help to hold the cells in place and to allow nourishment and communication to happen. Most of the tissue in your body, again, is connective. Before we talk about specific connective tissue types, we have to discuss cells and fibers, because we're going to see 3 different cells and 3 different fibers. So I have the 3 cells pictured over here to the right. This first star-shaped or triangle-shaped cell is called a fibroblast, and you can see based on how it looks very spider-webby that it is producing all of the fibers we'll see in our connective tissue. So fibroblasts are our most common fixed cell. They're said to be star-shaped, and that's just to allude to all the projections that they have coming off of them. I said their job was to secrete fibers into the ECM. Macrophages are here for defense. So macrophages usually are attached to fibers, but they can move. Fibroblasts are fixed. Macrophages conduct a process called phagocytosis, which is really just cellular ingestion. They wrap around any sort of foreign pathogen or foreign cell, maybe even damaged human cell, and they break it down. So they can help defend us against infection and keep our connective tissues healthy. The last cell type we'll see in connective tissue is mast cells, and that looks like this lump of lumps, I guess, right here. And ultimately, it's in control of blood vessels. So they're large and fixed, but they release heparin to stop blood from clotting, if we don't want it to, and histamine to cause inflammation if there is some sort of damage or infection. So just sort of constantly monitoring to see if we need to regulate blood flow. 3 types of cells. We'll also see 3 different fiber types. Collagen is our body's main structural protein, and it's going to be the thickest. So on this diagram right here, it looks purple, and it almost looks like the broadest kinds of hairs on here. These are collagen fibers. They're really strong, but they also have flexible bend to them. You might have heard of collagen when discussing the aging industry and like beauty products. We're trying to preserve collagen because it keeps your skin bouncy and tight. That's because it's a strong, flexible protein. Things can bounce back. We find a lot of collagen in places like tendons and ligaments where we need to have stretch and movement, but also not tearing. Elastic fibers, sometimes called yellow fibers because of how they appear under the microscope if it's not stained. These are stained fibers, which is why they look so dark. But yellow fibers are composed of this elastin protein, which makes it very stretchy. Because it's thin, though, it's also kind of fragile. So we find this in vocal cords and air passageways, but this is not going to be the stuff that holds your bones together. It's just going to be something that is able to stretch a little bit. The last type of fiber is the smallest, and they're not even shown on the photograph over here because they're so small. Reticular fibers are just thin and supportive. They're just kind of like filler to keep that tissue in its specific shape. Find a lot of these in your liver and your spleen, but ultimately we won't focus too heavily on reticular. Okay, So specific types of connective tissue. Your headings are going to change here. So these first three all fall into the category of proper loose connective tissue. Areolar tissue forms most of the thin, delicate membranes in your body. It has a lot of fibroblasts and also a lot of collagen and a lot of elastic. It's found underneath your epithelium, so it's the first thing you'd see underneath your simple squamous or your stratified cuboidal, and its main role is to nourish the epithelial cells above them. Adipose tissue is a fancy way of saying fat. So adipose stores fat from the diet. There is an excess of adipose found around the heart that is healthy to a degree. If you have too much fat around your heart, it can be bad, but everyone's heart has some fat ready to provide the heart with energy as needed and also to insulate and protect it. There's lumps of fat on your kidneys, and then, of course, any body fat is composed of adipose. Under the microscope, I can identify adipose tissue because it looks like big, wide open bubbles, almost as if you've blown into a glass of milk with a straw. You can see big fat droplets in those cells. The nuclei in these cells are pushed off to the side because they're mostly just filled with fat. And the purpose here is to cushion and insulate internal organs as well as the body in general. Reticular tissue, not as common, composed of reticular fibers, and it really, again, just supports the walls of those internal organs. You will see areolar fibers or areolar tissue with these strong elastic fibers under the microscope. You'll see adipose tissue. We're not going to focus too heavily on reticular, but be aware that it exists. These next three types are proper connective tissues, but they're known as dense connective tissues. Dense regular tissue, if you look at this picture here, is really aesthetically pleasing. It comes in these very regular wavy patterns, and that's how you'll recognize it. Those waves are closely packed collagenous, meaning like collagen, fibers, it says in a consistent orientation, so very regular. They're super strong, they can withstand a lot of pulling, and we find these in your tendons, in your ligaments, and in the lower levels of your skin. Dense irregular tissue, on the other hand, is composed more of fibers that are not regularly arranged, so they're randomly organized collagen fibers. They can withstand tension in many different directions, and they are found mostly around your skeletal muscles. I couldn't find a great picture of dense irregular. It's the pink tissues in here. But ultimately, you need to know that it's the same fibers, those collagen fibers, but they're not so neatly organized. They allow things to expand and contract, much like your muscles do when you can flex them or relax them. Lastly, we have elastic tissue. It has a ton of elastic fibers, so very, very stretchy, and we find that these things allow body parts to stretch and expand without tearing. So very, very helpful in airways, arteries, hollow organs. We see it in your aorta because there's a lot of blood pressure there, but as your heart beats, this little tube needs to be able to expand and then contract again. So elastic tissue is perfect for that function. We have 3 to 5, depending on how you classify it, specialized connective tissues, so very specific jobs. Cartilage, there are 3 different types. Hyaline cartilage has really fine collagen fibers, and that's the cartilage you find in between your joints. If you move your nose around, it's that hard cartilage that you can find on the protruding, the beak part of your nose. And also embryos. Before an embryo forms its bones, it makes a model skeleton out of hyaline cartilage first. Elastic cartilage has more elastic fibers than collagen fibers, and that is the stretchy outside of your ear and also your larynx, the part of your vocal cord and your vocal box. So your nose is a little bit harder and stronger than the outside of your ear, which you can feel when you move them around and stretch them. The ear is certainly more flexible. And then fibrocartilage, really thick, really strong collagen fibers found in the joints that are under the most weight every day. So your knees, the discs in between your spine, these are shock-absorbing cartilage pads that are very, very strong. bone is considered a specialized type of connective tissue. We have 2 units devoted to the skeletal system. So just a brief overview here, that bone is a solid matrix of salts, but there's living cells and living collagen fibers in between. Your bones are not dead. Bone supports, protects, and produces blood cells. If we look under the microscope, bone looks like the rings of a tree. So we see a really dark central canal here, and then we see these outer rings outside. The last type of specialized connective tissue would be blood. Blood should be the easiest to identify under the microscope. You can see tons of red blood cells, a couple white blood cells, and blood is a fluid matrix that transports, clots, moves gas around, and is responsible for your immune response. So 3 to 5, depending on how you count them, types of specialized connective tissue. Your case study for this unit covers connective tissues. It's called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And part of your case study will ask you to assess your own flexibility to determine if you have EDS, or at least some of the markers of EDS. And we'll learn which tissue type is affected and what are the causes of this condition.